In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians managed to make several advances to the east of Lyman and the northwest of the city, as they considered offensive operations to cut off the logistics leading into the city, as well as covering the fortifications on the eastern flank to start the battle of the city itself. In turn, the Ukrainians managed to recapture several settlements and towns on the northern flank of Pokrovsk and Minnerad, as they started a large offensive north of the city the past 3 days following the Russian capture of Rodinsk. The alarm clocks were all ringing for the Ukrainians, and this forced them to double down on their counterattack operations north of the city to free up the forces currently withdrawing from both cities. Starting out in the Vovchansk direction, the Russians continued offensive operations both within Vovchansk and in the direction of Sinelnikova. In the direction of Sinelnikova, the Russians managed to gain control over the westernmost street, as well as the forest patch area to the west of the town. The Russians continued offensive operations along the forested area to gain full control over the western forest here west of Vovchansk. At the same time, the Russians managed to gain control over additional parts of the railway area here in the central parts of Vovchansk. The Russians are looking to gain full control over Vovchansk. The main part to gain control of is along the railway itself, following which it is a regular residential area in the eastern and central parts of the town. This means that the Russians are currently fighting over the most difficult parts of Vovchansk, following which the Ukrainians will be hard-pressed to keep their positions and instead may be forced to withdraw from the town and the general positions along the Vovcha River line, as Russians will be able to gain control over additional parts along the Vovcha River line. As for the Sinelnikova advance, the Russians further cut off the supplies leading into the western parts of Vovchansk, as they've already cut off the main road, and now they're also advancing along the railway lines. This is to isolate the settlements here along the Vovcha River line and the Seversky Donetsk River line from the supplies coming from the Kharkiv city. To the east of Vovchansk, along the border between the Kharkiv and Belgorod regions, the Russians managed to gain control over the forest line areas here to the west of Polohivka, covering the flank of the town, as well as the forest patch area along the border, gaining full control over the border area between the Belgorod and Kharkiv region, from the Luhansk region all the way to the eastern parts here near the Vorishna. This is a wide area of the front line that is now under Russian control and is expanding the frontline positions, which means it increases the pressure on the Ukrainian forces and widens the area where Ukrainian forces are needed to hold the frontline positions. The capture of the forest line areas west of Polohivka also opens the eastern and northern flank for Russian forces to push in the direction of the Vovchansk, which is the final town in between Kamyanka and the northern front. This will allow the Russians to connect the northern and eastern parts near the Usk River line through the roads connecting from Kamyanka up towards the Vovchansk. This will allow the Russians to concentrate their forces on the eastern parts towards the line of settlements here to the west, which is the main areas where Ukrainian forces are operating from in this section of the front line. To the south in the Lyman direction, the Russians managed to make several advances, advancing both to the east of the city along the Sarishna direction, gaining full control over the road from Sarishna up towards fortifications northeast of Stavki, leaving just a small part remaining under Ukrainian control in between Sarishna and Drobisheve. As for the eastern flank, the Russians managed to gain control over the forest patch area here to the west of Sarishna along the first line of defense east of Lyman. The Russians are already operating within the central parts of Lyman, where according to Willy, who has contacts within both Russian and Ukrainian army, he came with exclusive news that the Russians are already along the railway area in Lyman itself, which means the first Russian forces, the DRG units and sabotage units, are already operating within the city. This means the battle of the city has begun. As for the eastern fortifications, the fighting continues over the first and second lines of defense, as well as the third line of defense in the eastern flank of the city. With the advances in the northwest of Drobisheve in the direction of Novoselivka, the Russians have started storming the forest patch area, gaining control over additional forest patches west of Novoselivka and along the major forest patch area along the Seversky Donetsk River here to the west of Lyman. The Russians, with this, have started a battle towards Yarova, where they're looking to cut off the final supply route leading into Lyman from the northwestern direction. Getting a bit closer, we see the Russians have gained a foothold within the forest patch area, which also cuts off the western road into Novoselivka, leaving just the forest patch road into the town, which they are now contesting with the fighting inside the forest patch area. With this, the Russians have cut off the eastern, western, and northern roads into Novoselivka, leaving just this southern road, which is now contested, which means the Ukrainian positions within Novoselivka are operational encircled, with the Russian forces having direct fire control over the road leading into the town, which means the Ukrainians will either be forced to withdraw from the town, or all supplies going in to resupply their forces will be struck by the Russian forces operating on the flanks. To the north of that, the Russians have advanced along the forest patch area, where they're now operating to the west of Novoselivka, gaining an additional foothold within the forest patch area and closing in on the next settlement, which is Oleksandrivka, which connects the Sosnov direction, which is along the railway and has a railway station, to the supplies further north, which means that it is an important logistical choke point of the Ukrainian forces. If the Russians are able to gain control of it, they can threaten the positions of the Ukrainians in the direction of Krymki, Kurovy Yar, Rupsi, Yetskivka, and along the Usk River line, because the supplies going there will be significantly limited. It will also allow the Russians to put pressure on Sosnova itself and down towards Yarova, which will further isolate the Ukrainian positions in the direction of Lyman. In the direction of the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainian forces managed to recapture several positions. They managed to regain full control over the road leading to Shahove from the northern direction, although the Russians still control the western parts of Shahove, which cuts off the road directly at Shahove, which still prevents the Ukrainians from resupplying the forces within the town. However, the supplies going to the fortifications north of Shahove are now secure. As for Novoselivka, the Russians were pushed out of the settlement, the Ukrainians getting full control over it. As for the south of this, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over Sukhetske, here to the west of Satyshok. However, there is still some confusion with regards to Satyshok, as the Ukrainians claim that they have managed to gain full control of it and the Russians were kicked out of the settlement. However, as we see with this geolocated footage, there is geolocated footage of the Ukrainians regaining control over Sukhetske. As for Satyshok, there is no footage. I kept searching and didn't find any footage of the Ukrainians recapturing Satyshok. Deep State Map claims the Ukrainians recaptured it. However, Radov, which is a reliable Russian source with contact with Russian soldiers operating in the area, claims that it remains under Russian control. However, Ukrainian forces are storming the settlement, which puts it at a contested status. That is why, based on contemplating the positions of both sides, I deemed it as a contested settlement that neither side has control over, as the Ukrainians are heavily pressing the settlement. According to the reports coming from the area, the Ukrainians restarted a large offensive in the northern flank of Myndarat and Pokrovsk to regain control over these positions. The objective is to isolate Rodinsk following the Russian capture of the settlement, to regain control over it by encircling it and storming it. This will allow them to resupply their forces within Myndarat and Pokrovsk, with control over the road from Dobropilya down towards Myndarat. The Russian capture of Rodinsk puts immense pressure on the supplies going in and out of Myndarat and Pokrovsk, and also limits the Ukrainian ability to withdraw their forces from Myndarat. This means that the Russians are currently working on reorganizing their forces to prevent a Ukrainian breakthrough north of Rodinsk, even if it means preventing their forces from cutting off the highway to the northwest of Myndarat. As long as the FPV drone operators can strike their forces, then the control over Rodinsk is still important. However, if they lose their positions within Rodinsk, even FPV drone operators will not be able to completely stop the supply or withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from Myndarat and Pokrovsk. Therefore, the Russians will prioritize the northern flank of Rodinsk to prevent the encirclement of their forces and to hold control over Rodinsk. However, considering the scale of the Ukrainian counterattack over the past few days, the Ukrainians are almost certainly going to be storming Rodinsk in the coming days, where they'll look to regain control over the settlement, while they're also storming the supply lines leading into Rodinsk from the eastern direction. Based on these developments, we can say that the Battle of Pokrovsk and Myndarat has yet to be determined, and as I stated at the very start of the Russian Dobropilya incursion, and that is that the northern flank of Pokrovsk and Myndarat is going to be decisive for the battle over both of these cities. If the Russians will be able to hold their positions and control over Rodinsk on the northern flank, then they will quickly gain control over Myndarat and Pokrovsk. However, if the Ukrainian counterattack succeeds and they're able to regain control over the positions here in the salient north of Myndarat, then the supply lines will be reopened into Myndarat and the Ukrainians can restart the battle over these cities with more of their forces and supplies coming into these cities, allowing them to counterattack within the cities themselves. That is, if the Russians do not gain full control over the city first. The Russians continued offensive operations within Pokrovsk, where they managed to gain control over additional parts of the industrial area to the northwest of the city, as they're looking to cut off the roads that goes through the dacha areas in the northern parts of Pokrovsk, leaving just the northern highway under Ukrainian control to resupply and withdraw their forces from Milnerad and Pokrovsk. This means the Russians are here looking to advance along the dacha areas in the northwestern parts of the city, and then push towards the intersections here in the western parts of Milnerad, eastern parts of Pokrovsk, to physically encircle both Pokrovsk and Milnerad and connect with the forces in the Rodinsk direction. Therefore, it is a race of time and capabilities between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, between whether the Russians can gain control over Pokrovsk and Milnerad before the Ukrainians regain control over Rodinsk, or if the Russians will be able to hold on to these positions, or if the Ukrainians will be able to recapture Rodinsk fast enough to open the road and supplies to Pokrovsk and Milnerad and start counterattacks in these directions. This also means that the Ukrainians will limit the withdrawal of their forces from Milnerad and Pokrovsk and actually send reinforcements to these areas rather than withdraw from them, to increase the odds of them succeeding on the northern flank of Milnerad, and therefore having a better foothold and chance at regaining control over cities. But this also increases the risks of failure. If they fail, then the cost will be much higher than if they are withdrawing from these areas. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians continued offensive operations here in the Vovchansk riverline direction, where they managed to regain control over Novoselivka in the southern outskirts of the settlement. This allowed them to regain control over the settlement and also puts additional pressure on Ukrainian forces operating within Sishneve and fortifications in between Sishneve and Sosnivka. And that's all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.